All right, I'm here. Twitch.tv/110sports. 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thanks so much for joining us on a Friday. It's the end of the week. Happy to have you here on the JMULL show, part of the 110 Sports Network. 110sportsmedia.com, twitch.tv/110sports. We got a lot to get to today. It's a pretty interesting day in the world of sports news. We're gonna bounce all around the country, all around the most popular sports in this country. We're gonna do some bouncing today. Let me set the agenda for you real quick. Steve Nash has put together quite an impressive coaching staff over there with the Brooklyn Nets. It being announced today that Mike D'Antoni has joined his coaching staff, as well as a 7-year-long assistant under Greg Popovich with the San Antonio Spurs, Ime Udoka. Mike D'Antoni and Steve Nash, the architect of the Phoenix Suns. 7 seconds or less offense in the mid-2000s, as Bill Simmons likes to say, a critically acclaimed basketball team, one that never won a title, one that never achieved the goals that you felt like they could achieve, but still a team that is pretty much a consensus. One of the best teams of the last 20 years, one of the more exciting teams of the last 20 years, so on and so forth. So they've put together quite a coaching staff, and what makes it even more interesting is the fact that, Kyrie Irving has said things like, I guess we're all coaches and we'll coach by committee. Kyrie, you got some prestige on the sideline now. All of them got more prestige than you do. So we'll see how it goes. So we'll talk about that at 11:20 or so. November 1st, live sports betting goes live in my home state of Tennessee. In other words, I can bet on the NFL football games on Sunday without jumping through a bunch of hoops and doing it, under the table, so to speak. Just load up the DraftKings Sportsbook, place my bets, and we're good to go. So that's what we're going to do towards the end of the show. We're going to start doing that every Friday, talking about the bets for the weekend. But that's November 1st. I'm excited about that. And not because, and here's the thing with me and betting. I don't bet to make money. That's where it gets dangerous, is when you bet to make money. But what it does do for me is that it gives me reasons to really care about games that otherwise I would not care about. My best example is, I believe it was last fall, and I think it was BYU and Tennessee college football, and my roommate and I just screaming at the TV because we had the under, or I believe it was the under, and Tennessee had to stop. The game was over, but Tennessee had to stop BYU from scoring for the under to hit, and they went for it on 4th down with 15 seconds left, and they're on the 3, 4th and goal, and Tennessee stops them. The under hits. We get the payout. It gives me a reason to get excited about some games and be invested in games that otherwise I might not have a real reason to be invested in, and that's just fun. So we'll talk about some of the bets I'm looking at for Sunday. Of course, can't do any college football betting because, like I said, it doesn't drop until Sunday the 1st, but nonetheless, it'll make for a slightly more invigorating weekend in terms of watching football. But we'll do that at the end of the show. But the biggest news in sports on the back end of this week is, and really, it is Trevor Lawrence, Clemson quarterback, guaranteed number 1 overall pick if he goes to the draft, tested positive for COVID-19. mild symptoms, he says, experiencing relatively mild symptoms. Is unconfirmed at this time when those symptoms began for Lawrence. Coupled with ACC isolation protocols, it appears possible that he could be cleared to play against Notre Dame on Saturday, November 7th. Now, this weekend, Clemson is not playing anybody important. I believe it's Boston College. We're going to pull up the schedule right now. Yes, so they play BC tomorrow at 11 a.m. Central Time, but then they go to Notre Dame. Notre Dame, the number 4 team in the country right now, and that's where this gets really interesting, because based on the ACC protocol, and here's a quote from the ACC's protocol for this. Pursuant to CDC guidance, a student athlete who tests positive for COVID-19 shall be isolated for at least 10 days from the onset of symptoms / positive test, and at least 1 day has passed since recovery, defined as resolution of fever without the use of fever-reducing medications and improvement of respiratory symptoms. So what first needs to be determined is when symptoms began for Lawrence. If that date preceded his positive test on Wednesday, that would be the earlier start to his isolation clock, because that's important now. Because so at this point, November 7th, we're 8 days away from November 7th. He tested positive on Wednesday. That would 10 days, but if he started having symptoms on Monday, then that would make him eligible, assuming that his symptoms have gone away and he's tested negative. His symptoms starting on Monday would push the timeline farther back, or farther forward, depending on how you're looking at it, and that would make him eligible for the Notre Dame game on next Saturday, a week from tomorrow. If Lawrence's clock began Wednesday, it would expire next Friday as long as he is symptom-free for at least 24 hours and tests negative for COVID. Lawrence will also have to undergo a pass numeric cardiac test in order to see the field. Now, the beauty of being Clemson and being Dabo Swinney and being the head coach and being a program that is dominated college football in many ways for the last 5 years and has put Deshaun Watson in the NFL, and Trevor Lawrence is, there's certainly the potential for Trevor Lawrence to the percentage chance for Trevor Lawrence to be an all-time great is really high, relatively speaking, of course. And what that results in is you get more really high-level quarterbacks coming to your school because they want to be the next Deshaun Watson or the next Trevor Lawrence. They've got a 5-star prospect, DJ Uwagalele. We'll go with Uwagalele. That sounds about, I'm sure I'm butchering that, but Uwagalele, 5-star prospect in the class of 2020, the number one rated pro style quarterback in the class of 2020, also the 10th ranked recruit in the class period. So they're going to put a 5-star junior on the bench and bring a 5-star freshman in to start at quarterback for Boston College. I am genuinely intrigued with how he looks, because listen, and Trevor Lawrence is not going to get, no matter what DJ does, Trevor Lawrence is going to come back when he can come back, and he's going to be the starting quarterback. But once upon a time, Trevor Lawrence forced a guy to transfer. Trevor Lawrence was not the starting quarterback initially, and then it became very clear very quickly that he needed to be the starting quarterback. The point being is that DJ, in many ways, and Trevor Lawrence was the number one overall quarterback in his class in 2018, I believe. And he was the number one pro style quarterback. So the 2020 number one pro style quarterback is DJ. the last time that the number one overall pro style quarterback didn't start the season and then became the starter, it went pretty well. I say that to say it's not a foregone conclusion that let's say that Trevor Lawrence can't play against Notre Dame. It's not a foregone conclusion that Clemson loses that game. It is at Notre Dame. I'm sure that Notre Dame would be favored in that game without Trevor Lawrence, but the point being is that they're not in a horrible situation. Now, it looks like as long as things go the right way, Trevor Lawrence will be available to play in the Notre Dame game. There's also the thought of, if he comes out of isolation on Friday, is he really, how quickly does he have to get ready for Notre Dame? How are they preparing him for Notre Dame when he's in isolation? He hasn't thrown a football in 10 days, or at least not to anybody. How does that impact him just from a game ready perspective, from a game plan perspective, from a just being out there and going out there and being able to physically produce perspective? What does that do? It's an extremely intriguing situation that Clemson is in, because tomorrow DJ could go out there and, this year he's appeared in 5 games, 12 of 19, 102 yards, 32 rushing yards. Of course, he, all of that being garbage time, because sometimes Clemson is just so far and away ahead of their opponents. I mean, I have their numbers up right here. They're winning margins so far this year: 37-13, 49-0, 41-23, 42-17 to the, at the time, number 7 Miami. No, the current number 7 Miami, or maybe Miami is 11th. A top 25 team in Miami. 73-7 at Georgia Tech, and then 47-21 most recently against Syracuse. They're dominating football teams. There's a chance that they're going to dominate Boston College tomorrow. The point being is that there's a lot more to Clemson than Trevor Lawrence. And so tomorrow's going to be really interesting to just see how different they are, because they're still a great football team without Trevor Lawrence. They're just not. They're just not obviously the best team, or one of the best teams, depending on how you feel about Ohio State. They're just clearly, they're not the number one team in the country without Trevor Lawrence. At least not the same version of that number one team. But we'll see how it goes. I'm incredibly intrigued by this. This is also, it's interesting to see what he'll do. What if they lose to Notre Dame? What if they lose to Notre Dame? There are a couple things here. Let's start with this. If they lose to Notre Dame, how does the College Football Playoff Committee treat that? If they had beat Boston College, they lose to Notre Dame, either because Trevor Lawrence is not healthy, either he doesn't play or he's clearly not clicking on all cylinders. But then you go and dominate Florida State, Pitt, and Virginia Tech to end the season. And so you're a one-loss Clemson team, with your lone loss being at Notre Dame without Trevor Lawrence, hypothetically. And now let's look at the rest of the rankings and try to decipher this a little bit. So assuming Alabama goes undefeated, assuming Ohio State goes undefeated, assuming Notre Dame goes undefeated. Those are the other 3 teams that are in the top 4 of the AP poll at the moment. Who's next? Is it a one-loss Clemson? Assuming that Clemson goes on to be in the ACC championship game regardless, is it a one-loss Clemson team, a one-loss Georgia team? What if Oklahoma State runs the table? What if Cincinnati runs the table in the AAC? What if Oklahoma State runs the table in the Big 12? And then you have this one-loss Clemson team that is a one-loss team because of a COVID diagnosis to their best player and the best player in the country. think these are really interesting questions here, especially for a sport where it's a, they try to be objective as possible, but it's a group of people deciding which 4 teams get to play for a national championship. How do they? Because there could be a world in which there are 4 undefeated teams, and one of them is not Clemson, or one of them is not Clemson. Yes, Clemson's not one of them. What then? I think this is a really interesting look at how, and we're gonna have this same question in the college basketball season when we're talking about the field of 64. Now it's a little different because, even if a team goes on a 3-game losing streak because their best player is out for COVID reasons, that team, that is of Clemson's caliber, is still going to have no problem making the NCAA tournament. So it's a little different, but it's an interesting conversation here when we're talking about a college athletics, when the playoff field is set by a group of people rather than just a baseline record thing like it is for, Major League Baseball or the NFL or the NBA. Because if you get a COVID test in the NBA and your best player misses 3 weeks and you go 2-8 in those 3 weeks, and as a result you end up missing the playoffs, then it's just tough. Like that really sucks, but it's just tough, and you just deal with it. And it's also, it'd just be interesting to see how the world, based on how Clemson plays against Notre Dame, how the world reacts to a guy because this is college football's equivalent of LeBron James right now. Right? How would the NBA have reacted if LeBron James got COVID-19? How would the NFL react if Patrick Mahomes gets COVID-19? We talked about Justin Turner, and clearly Major League Baseball liberal with their protocols. But what if Mookie Betts before Game 7 tests positive for COVID-19? It's an interesting look at, and for the most part, COVID tests haven't destroyed seasons yet. The Cardinals still made the playoffs. The Marlins still made the playoffs. The Titans, even though they clearly were breaking the rules, haven't had to forfeit any of their games, and they're one of the best teams in football. If Clemson ends up losing football games as a result of this will be one of the first teams in American sports to really take a hard hit in terms of what they miss out on because of a positive COVID test. And maybe Ugalele is just incredible and it won't matter. I think that's certainly not out of the question. He won a state championship in California. That's hard to do. They're in Texas, really hard places to win to win high school football state championships. St. John Bosco's, by the way. So we'll see. I'm incredibly intrigued by this. I've never been more intrigued by a Clemson-Boston College matchup in my life, just to see what DJ looks like against, as the guy for an entire game against a college football defense. And we'll see how it goes. Coming up next, Steve Nash has Mike D'Antoni, and he's got a lot of experience on that bench. We'll talk about that, my thoughts on that, coming up next. You're watching the JMULL Show, 110sportsmedia.com, twitch.tv/110sports. Welcome back to the JMULL Show on a Friday. This song's lit. Welcome back to the JMULL Show on a Friday. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thank you so much for joining us to end the week. Steve Nash has put together quite the assistant coach roster. Quite the assistant coach roster. Mike D'Antoni is finalizing a deal. Mike D'Antoni finalizing a deal to become an assistant coach with the Brooklyn Nets, reuniting him with his former MVP point guard, Nets coach Steve Nash. The Nets are also hiring well-regarded assistant Ime Udoka, who spent the last 8 seasons under Greg Popovich. He's also got an associate head coach, Jacques Vaughn. And then you have Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant on the floor. So you've got a guy who spent 8 years under Greg Popovich. You can't tell me that's a bad thing. You got Steve Nash, first-year head coach, who has Steve Kerr to thank for the fact that he's a head coach. Or the Warriors organization, I guess, because part of that hire is the relationship, the pre-existing relationship that he had with Kevin Durant as a player guy for the Golden State Warriors. And then you have this combination of Steve Nash and Mike D'Antoni, who created this team in Phoenix that was just one of the more fun teams to watch of the mid-2000s. Just so much fun to watch. Steve Nash was my first favorite player in the NBA, at least one of them. But this stretch in the mid-2000s where D'Antoni was the coach in Phoenix for 4 years. They never won less than 54 games. Let's see, let me drag over here. 62-20, 54-28, 61-21, 55-27. They lost in the conference finals the first 2 years there, then lost in the conference semis, and then the conference first round in 2007 and 2008. That was a dynamite team to watch. Just a dynamite team to watch. If you look at the offensive ranking, the offensive ratings of the Suns teams all time, 2 of the top 4 are from that era. And excuse me, let's just roll all the way through. 3 of the top 6 are from that era of D'Antoni and Steve Nash. First and foremost here, Kyrie has made these interesting declarations about how they're going to coach by committee, and we don't really have a head coach. We'll just coach by committee. I can be a head coach. KD can be a head coach. Kyrie, you officially need to keep your mouth shut and go play basketball. Now, typically that's a negative thing to say, because typically that's people talking about not speaking out for social justice, and that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about a player trying to be a coach. And there are a few players that can be player coach, de facto player coaches. LeBron might be the only one right now, to be honest with you. There are some guys who are certainly floor generals, but here's the point. Kyrie Irving is not one of those guys. Why would you want a guy who consistently disrupts locker rooms? Why would you want that guy to be your voice, to be your main voice in the huddle and in the locker room? Why would you want that? Why would you do that? Why would you want that? Now, and hopefully, and I think part of why this is such an important hire, and both of these hires, both Udoka and D'Antoni, is that now you have a coaching staff that has more experience coaching than Kyrie does playing, which just wasn't the case for Steve Nash. Now, in theory, and this is only in theory because you never know really what you're going to get from Kyrie Irving. In theory, Kyrie respects the all-time point guard. In theory. But he's a first-year head coach. He hasn't even been there, Kyrie's only been in Brooklyn for, year 2 now, and he's been there longer than Nash has, of course. But there are reasons to get yourself to think that you know better for the team than the head coach does, especially when you're Kyrie Irving. But now you've got D'Antoni, now you've got Nash, now you've got Udoka, Vaughn. You've got this coaching staff that has, first of all, has a lot of pedigree, a lot of experience, and I think one that should work really well together. At least D'Antoni and Nash. And of course he was going to hire people that he gets along with, and as maybe has a guy that can push back but and force him to rise above. But the point being that D'Antoni and Nash have this pre-existing relationship that is going to trump Kyrie Irving. Like it should, but it's going to trump Kyrie Irving. That's a good thing. And then on the other side of things, you have D'Antoni, who's put together, he turned James Harden into James Harden, right? Which is, he was, this is what we're gonna do, and I think that James Harden is capable of being that guy. Now, Kyrie Irving and Kevin Durant are who they are in the NBA already. It's not like they're going to reinvent anybody. But when you ask about lucrative offenses or intriguing offenses or high-powered offenses over the last 20 years, you think of, at least for me, what jumps to the top of my head is the Warriors, Steve Nash. Now, giving Steve Nash a ton of credit for that offense is not what I'm saying here, but Steve Nash a part of that. The Phoenix Suns in the mid to late 2000s, D'Antoni and Steve Nash. And then the Rockets, D'Antoni. That is it, at the very least, intriguing. And then you've got some of these other pieces, your Jared Allens, your Karis LeVerts. I'm intrigued to see what the Nets do in the offseason, because there are some things I think they could go towards. But we've now got this interesting concoction of, it's all new to everybody, this group, but people who have played together, people who have worked together, pedigree, there's just a lot of it. There's a lot of different concoctions up in the air. Vaughn was on the coaching staff with San Antonio from 06 to 09. As a coach, he's been an assistant since 2016. He was that interim coach in 2020. So you've also got that pre-existing relationship too, with the Spurs and Udoka. Every time the Nets are in the news, I am more and more intrigued by what the Nets are doing. I like Steve Nash. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of reasons why he was hired. The way he approaches the game of basketball from a team perspective I think being the biggest one. And then you have your guys, and not saying he's not a brilliant basketball mind, he's a brilliant basketball mind, but then you bring in these other guys that are seasoned veterans on the sidelines that have won at a high level. I mean, of course, D'Antoni not winning a championship in Houston or in or in Phoenix, but he's been to that level, to the conference finals. He knows what it's like to coach there. Of course, if you're working for the Spurs for 8 years, you've seen success. Both Vaughn and Udoka having been a part of success in San Antonio. They know they've got a beautiful concoction of a young head coach, but one that is a great basketball mind with seasoned veterans behind him, and hopefully that equation can result in something good happening on the floor, specifically with Kyrie Irving. That's the biggest, because while Durant wasn't, I think the bulk of Durant's unhappiness in Golden State was with Draymond Green. I'm not sure Durant is. Durant might still be a Warrior if Draymond Green's not there. My point being is that Durant doesn't have Durant's legacy of course is always going to be that he left the Thunder to go to the Warriors. But it's not, you're not seeing a lot in the news about how you're having issues with Kevin Durant as a locker room guy unless it's with Draymond Green. And of course, there's going to be some butting of heads when you have as many stars as that Warriors team did. But I'm not worried about Kevin Durant's locker room behavior and just how he contributes to the atmosphere and the tone of the Nets. I'm worried about that with Kyrie, because Kyrie has now been, the last two teams that Kyrie has been a part of have without a doubt been better without him than with him. The Nets were a better team last year without Kyrie on the floor. The Celtics were absolutely a better team without Kyrie on the floor. The Celtics almost were a win away from the NBA Finals without Kevin Durant and without Kyrie Irving on the floor. I'm still worried, but I think what the Nets have done has put themselves in a position to make that negative impact that Kyrie has in certain situations as minuscule as possible. I think they've put themselves in that position, and that's a really good thing, that they've found a way to make that happen. I like that a lot. I think that's a really good thing for the Nets. And while it's going to be hard for them to be near the top of the Eastern Conference, they keep making moves that make me believe in them a little more. And if they're healthy, I see no reason to suggest that they shouldn't be towards the top of the Eastern Conference. But we'll see. We'll see how it goes. I like the decisions they've been making, though. Coming up next, I want to talk about some bets. Let's take a look at what's happening on the NFL side of things in terms of betting this weekend. We'll take a look coming up next as we enter the world of live sports betting here in the state of Tennessee on Sunday. But we'll do that next. You're watching the JMULL Show, 110sportsmedia.com, twitch.tv/110sports. Welcome back to the JMULL Show on a Friday. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thanks so much for joining us on a Friday. Listen, November 1st, we entered the promised land. We will enter the promised land here in the state of Tennessee. On Sunday, I will be able to load currency into the DraftKings Sportsbook app and then wager said currency on NFL games. So let's go through it. Yeah? Shall we? Looking at a couple things this week. First of all, the Packers are favored by 6.5 at home against the Vikings. If you'd have told me before week 1, because once upon a time I actually picked the Vikings to win that division. If you would have told me before week 1 that when the Packers and Vikings played in week 8, that the Packers were going to be favored by basically a touchdown, I would have told you were crazy. There's no way those two teams are that different. But the Vikings have been a train wreck. A train wreck since the beginning of the season. And now they're 6.5 dogs against the Packers. Let's see, the Dolphins and Rams. The Rams minus 3.5 at Miami. That's an interesting one with Tua. Just that the Dolphins are an interesting team to watch nowadays because of that switch to Tua at quarterback. The best game of one of the best games of the weekend, Steelers Ravens. I'm actually surprised that the Steelers are +4 at the moment. That's a little bit more breathing room for the Steelers than I thought they would get. And more breathing room for the Ravens than I thought they would get. I think winning by more than 3 points is a pretty tall task. Cleveland minus 2.5 against the Raiders. The Bills get -4 at home against the Patriots. That Patriots defense is pretty good, but man, they just can't. They can't score the football. To save their lives, they can't score the football. Cam Newton hasn't been anywhere near as good as he was prior to getting injured, and so -4 for the Bills. I actually think that's a little closer than I would have expected it to be. I mean, we're talking 33-6 loss, 18-12, 26-10. They haven't scored more than 12 points since week 3 when they scored 36 against the Raiders. And then you've got, on Monday night, you've got a +12 dog for the Giants against the Bucks. That's about right. The Dallas Cowboys +9. I don't know about that. That's a lot of points. You know, they've been horrible. And I've talked on this show about them, you know, do they win another football game? But that's also so many points. With that being said, now that we've sort of looked through all of them, the two games that I'm looking at, number 1, the Titans -6 at the Bengals. Listen, first of all, this Titans team is really good. And then second of all, Joe Burrow probably going to have another week where he won't have Joe Mixon. That offensive line is just absolutely, like, he's getting smoked every single game because that offensive line is just not any good. And knowing that they're going to pass a lot and also not having a good offensive line are two things that don't mix well. Joe Mixon likely won't be there again. Sure, the Titans defense is not very good, but what are the Bengals going to do to stop Derrick Henry and Ryan Tannehill, who I'm certainly a Ryan Tannehill skeptic, but he continues to play like a top 10 quarterback in this league. And then you have Derrick Henry, who's just unfair, running away from guys while also being able to barrel over guys at 250. I expect the Titans to cover -6. And then I touched on it briefly, but then the Cowboys and the Eagles. Carson Wentz playing some good football at the moment. The Cowboys are just horrible. The Cowboys don't really have an offensive line right now, and the Eagles' defensive front is just so good. The Cowboys also, who's their starting quarterback? Exactly. It's probably going to be a long day for Dallas, especially in Philly. I don't know what the weather's supposed to be like in Philly, but I'm guessing, we're here in Tennessee, and it's 47 outside right now, which is not super cold, but it's also colder than it's been. Philadelphia this week, if we're looking at the 10-day, on Sunday, we're looking at a high of 60, but some rain. Okay. It's probably going to rain, actually. High of 60 with a 70% chance of rain. But that line is now -9. It was -7.5 at one point, which is a pretty significant difference. But I suppose if you're either going to win by a touchdown or you're going to win by 10 points or more, there's not always an in-between there. So I'm still a fan of taking the Eagles to cover because, man, that Cowboys team is just so bad. But yeah, and I'll probably throw maybe some prop bets in there, so some and bet on some other stuff throughout the day. But I'm excited. It's fun to have a reason to get a little bit more invested, even if it's for $1 or whatever it might be. But yeah, we're gonna start doing this, and we'll talk about my success on Mondays, and we'll start doing this as we get more things to bet on. And of course, we'll be able to bet on college football next weekend, and have a chance to talk about them on Fridays, and then come back and reflect on our mistakes, no doubt, on Mondays. Coming up next, we'll do some FYI, get out of here on a Friday. You're watching the JMULL Show on 110sportsmedia.com. Welcome back to the JMULL Show on a Friday. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thank you so much for joining us on a Friday. Let's look at some of the more interesting college football games of the weekend for your information. For your information, in the top 25 world, Marshall taking on Florida Atlantic. Listen, I want to touch on this. We touched on this on the Bonfire. If you haven't checked that out yet, you can find that podcast over at 110sportsmedia.com or anywhere you get your podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you find your podcast, you can find it there. But what happens when you don't have non-conference games, or not as many at least, is you get teams specifically in the Sun Belt, but it's happening in other places, because typically these mid-major football teams are subject to these bye games. They go and get paid to play at Clemson, and you're going to lose. You're just not going to win that game. What happens, though, and that game's actually been postponed. My bad. But the point is still the same here, is that then you get these mid-major teams who win the right game, specifically Coastal Carolina, who's now 5-0. They're 20th in the country. They go and beat Kansas. Now, Kansas is not a high-quality football team at all, but you go and play a Big 12 school. You beat that Big 12 school, and then you're just the best team in your conference. So you have these teams that make up a much more colorful top 25 than you usually would. Cincinnati's in the top 7, SMU, Boise State, Coastal Carolina, Marshall, BYU, throw BYU in there as well. The point being is that you get this colorful top 25 because you don't have as many mid-majors going and just being, you don't have as many mid-major opportunities to just go and get paid to lose, essentially. Memphis at Cincinnati. Memphis, it's had a pretty rough go of it. You've had COVID-19 outbreaks. They lose one game by less than a touchdown, I believe, and it was tied late in that game. Losing to SMU 30-27. They beat UCF. They beat Temple, and now you've got this game against Cincinnati, the number 7 team in the country. That's an interesting one. Michigan State. Michigan, I like a lot. I like Joe Milton. That offense is more dynamic than it has been any time recently, and Michigan State's just a bad football team. Coastal on the road at Georgia State. Iowa State 3-2, top 25 team at Kansas. That'll be an easy one. Alabama, Mississippi State, and then you've got probably the best game of the weekend is Wisconsin and Nebraska would have been really interesting. It's now been canceled. But Ohio State at Penn State, 6:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. I'm excited about that one. You got some good relatively good football games this weekend, and we're still at that point with the Big Ten where I just want to see Big Ten teams play football, which seems obvious. But it's only week 2 of Big Ten football. You've just sort of got a good slate. You've got 3 games at 11 Central that are interesting. You've got Boston College at Clemson just to see what DJ looks like. Memphis, Cincinnati, being from West Tennessee, certainly got some alliance with the Tigers. Michigan State at 11, and then you got Texas at Oklahoma State. Oklahoma State, I believe, the only remaining Big 12 team that is undefeated. So that's just an interesting one because it is Texas, and it's a big game for Oklahoma State. And Oklahoma State at this moment, really the only chance that the Big 12 has to actually get into the college football playoff. And then you get to 6:30. That game's at 3, and then you get to 6:30, and you got that Ohio State Penn State game. So it's a pretty good weekend of college football. The Major League Baseball has launched an investigation into what Justin Turner did following his positive coronavirus test. I feel that, they've definitely gotten some backlash from it, but it's been reported that he just sort of refused to follow the rules, which is pretty crappy on his part, if I'm going to be honest with you. Breaking news from Jeff Goodman. Texas Tech's Mac McClung, Gate City, Virginia, YouTube social media sensation, went to Georgetown, transferred from there, and has received a waiver to play this season, according to Jeff Goodman on Twitter. So that's dope. I like Mac McClung. Those who know me know that I'm a Mac McClung fan. So that's certainly a win for Chris Beard in that program. Of course, I'll be back 11 a.m. Eastern on Monday. Touchdown Talk with Josh Doring, Around the Bases with Chris Brown. Those two shows airing on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but I'll be back prior to that. Thank you so much for hanging out another week of 110 Sports. If you haven't checked out what's on the site over at 110sportsmedia.com, please do. Very much appreciate it. But that's all we have for you today. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the JMULL Show. Stay safe this weekend. Enjoy it. And we'll meet back here at 11 a.m. Eastern right here at 110sportsmedia.com/live and twitch.tv/110sports.